Part 5. Matters of Life and Death. Chapter 38. Florida. Mrs. Halloran's third son, Dick, dressed in his cook's whites, a lucky strike parked in the corner of his mouth, backed his reclaimed Cadillac limo out of its space behind the 1A Wholesale Vegetable Mart and drove slowly around the building. Masterton, part owner now, but still walking with the patented shuffle he had adopted back before World War II, was pushing a bin of lettuces into the high, dark building. Halloran pushed the button that lowered the passenger side window and hollered, "Those avocados is too damn high, you cheapskate." Masterton looked back over his shoulder, grinned widely enough to expose all 3 gold teeth, and yelled back, "And I know exactly where you can put 'em, my good buddy." "Remarks like that I keep track of, bro." Masterton gave him the finger. Halloran returned the compliment. "Get your cukes, did you?" Masterton asked. "I did." "You come back early tomorrow. I gonna give you some of the nicest new potatoes you ever seen." "Well, send the boy," Halloran said. "You coming up tonight?" "You supplying the juice, bro?" "Well, that's a big 10-4. "Well, I be there. You keep that thing off the top and going home. You hear me? Every cop between here and St. Pete knows your name." "You know all about it, huh?" Halloran asked, grinning. "I know more than you'll ever learn, my man." "Listen to this sassy Would you listen?" "Go on, get out of here before I start throwing these lettuces." "Go on and throw 'em. I'll take anything for free." Masterton made as if to throw one. Halloran ducked, rolled up the window, and drove on. He was feeling fine. For the last half hour or so, he had been smelling oranges. But he didn't find that queer. For the last half hour, he had been in a fruit and vegetable market. It was 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The first day of December. Old Man Winter settling his frostbitten rump firmly onto most of the country. But down here, the men wore open-throated short-sleeved shirts, and the women were in light summer dresses and shorts. On top of the First Bank of Florida building, a digital thermometer bordered with huge grapefruits was flashing 79 degrees over and over. Thank God for Florida, Halloran thought, mosquitoes and all. In the back of the limo were 24 avocados, a crate of cucumbers, ditto oranges, ditto grapefruit, 3 shopping sacks filled with Bermuda onions, the sweetest vegetable a loving God ever created, some pretty good sweet peas, which would be served with the entree and come back uneaten 9 times out of 10, and a single blue Hubbard squash that was strictly for personal consumption. Halloran stopped in the turn lane at the Vermont Street light, and when the green arrow showed, he pulled out onto State Highway 219, pushing up to 40 and holding it there until the town began to trickle away into an exurban sprawl of gas stations, Burger Kings, and McDonald's. It was a small order today. He could have sent Baedeker after it, but Baedeker had been chafing for his chance to buy the meat, and besides, Halloran never missed a chance to bang it back and forth with Frank Masterton if he could help it. Masterton might show up tonight to watch some TV and drink Halloran's Bushmills, or he might not. Either way was all right. But seeing him mattered. Every time it mattered now, because they weren't young anymore. In the last few days, it seemed he was thinking of that very fact a great deal. Not so young anymore. When you got up near 60 years old, or tell the truth and save a lie, past it. You had to start thinking about stepping out. You could go any time. And that had been on his mind this week, not in a heavy way, but as a fact. Dying was a part of living. You had to keep tuning in to that if you expect to be a whole person. And if the fact of your own death was hard to understand, at least it wasn't impossible to accept. Why this should have been on his mind, he could not have said. But his other reason for getting this small order himself was so that he could step upstairs to the small office over Frank's Bar and Grill. There was a lawyer up there now. The dentist, who had been there last year, had apparently gone broke. A young black fellow named McIver. Halloran had stepped in and told this McIver that he wanted to make a will. And could McIver help him out? Well, McIver asked, "How soon do you want the document?" "Yesterday," said Halloran, and threw his head back and laughed. "Have you got anything complicated in mind?" was McIver's next question. Halloran did not. He had his Cadillac, his bank account, some $9,000, a piddling checking account, and a closet of clothes. He wanted it all to go to his sister. "And if your sister predeceases you?" McIver asked. "Well, never mind," Halloran said. "If that happens, I'll make a new will." The document had been completed and signed in less than 3 hours. Fast work for a shyster. And now resided in Halloran's breast pocket, folded into a stiff blue envelope with the word "will" on the outside in old English letters. He could not have said why he had chosen this warm, sunny day when he felt so well to do something he had been putting off for years, but the impulse had come on him, and he hadn't said no. He was used to following his hunches. He was pretty well out of town now. He cranked the limo up to an illegal 60 and let it ride there in the left-hand lane, sucking up most of the Petersburg-bound traffic. He knew from experience that the limo would still ride as solid as iron at 90, and even at 120 it didn't seem to lighten up much. But his screaming days were long gone. The thought of putting the limo up to 120 on a straight stretch only scared him. He was getting old. Jesus, those oranges smell strong. Wonder if they gone over. Bugs splattered against the window. He dialed the radio to a Miami soul station and got the soft, wailing voice of Al Green. "What a beautiful time we had together. Now it's getting late, and we must leave each other." He unrolled the window, pitched the cigarette butt out, then rolled it farther down to clear out the smell of the oranges. He tapped his fingers against the wheel and hummed along under his breath. Hooked over the rearview mirror, his St. Christopher's medal swung gently back and forth. And suddenly the smell of oranges intensified, and he knew it was coming. Something was coming at him. He saw his own eyes in the rear view widening, surprised. Then it came all at once. Came in a huge blast that drove out everything else. The music, the road ahead, his own absent awareness of himself as a unique human creature. It was as if someone had put a psychic gun to his head and shot him with a .45 caliber scream. "Oh, Dick, oh, please, please, please come." The limo had just drawn even with the Pinto station wagon, driven by a man in a workman's clothes. The workman saw the limo drifting into his lane and laid on the horn. When the Cadillac continued to drift, he snapped a look at the driver and saw a big black man bolt upright behind the wheel, his eyes looking vaguely upward. Later, the workman told his wife that he knew it. It was just one of those hairdos they were all wearing these days. But at the time, it had looked just as if every hair on the head was, oh boy, Stephen. He thought the black man was having a heart attack. The workman braked hard, dropping back into a luckily empty space behind him. The rear end of the Cadillac pulled ahead of him, still cutting in, and the workman stared with bemused horror as the long rocket-shaped rear tail lights cut into his lane no more than a quarter of an inch in front of his bumper. The workman cut to the left, still laying on his horn, and roared around the drunkenly weaving limousine. He invited the driver of the limo to perform an illegal sex act on himself, to engage in oral congress with various rodents and birds. He articulated his own proposal that all persons of... he was a racist. He expressed his sincere belief in the position of the limo driver's soul would occupy in the afterlife. He finished by saying that he believed he had met the limo driver's mother in a New Orleans house of prostitution. Then he was ahead and out of danger, and suddenly aware that he had wet his pants. In Halloran's mind, the thought kept repeating, "Come, Dick, please, please, come, Dick, please." But it began to fade off, the way a radio station will as you approach the limits of a broadcasting area. He became fuzzily aware that his car was tooling along the soft shoulder at better than 50 miles an hour. He guided it back onto the road, feeling the rear end fishtail for a moment before regaining the composition surface. There was an A&W root beer stand just ahead. Halloran signaled and turned in, his heart thudding painfully in his chest, his face a sickly gray color. He pulled into a parking slot, took his handkerchief out of his pocket, and mopped his forehead with it. Lord God! "May I help you?" A voice startled him again, even though it wasn't the voice of God, but that of a cute little car hop, standing by his open window with an order pad. "Yeah, baby, a root beer float, 2 scoops of vanilla, okay?" "Yes, sir." She walked away, hips rolling nicely beneath her red nylon uniform. Halloran leaned back against the leather seat and closed his eyes. There was nothing left to pick up. The last of it had faded out between pulling in here and giving the waitress his order. All that was left was a sick, thudding headache, as if his brain had been twisted and wrung out and hung up to dry. Like the headache he'd gotten from letting that boy Danny shine at him up there at Ullman's Folly. But this had been much louder. Then the boy had only been playing a game with him. This had been pure panic. Each word screamed aloud in his head. He looked down at his arms. Hot sunshine lay on them, but they had still goosebumped. He had told the boy to call him if he needed help. He remembered that. And now the boy was calling. He suddenly wondered how he could have left that boy up there at all, shining the way he did. There was bound to be trouble, maybe bad trouble. He suddenly keyed the limo, put it in reverse, pulled back onto the highway, peeling rubber. The waitress with the rolling hips stood in the A&W stand's archway, a tray with a root beer float on it in her hands. "What is it with you, a fire?" she shouted, but Halloran was gone. The manager was a man named Queems. And when Halloran came in, Queems was conversing with his bookie. He wanted a 4-horse at Rockaway. No parlay, no quinella, no exacta, no goddamn futura. Just the little old $600 on the nose. And the Jets on Sunday. What did he mean? The Jets were playing the Bills? Didn't he know who the Jets were playing? 500, 7-point spread. When Queems hung up, looking put out, Halloran understood how a man could make $50,000 a year running this little spa and still wear suits and shiny seats. He regarded Halloran with an eye that was still bloodshot from too many glances into last night's bourbon bottle. "Problems, Dick?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Queems. I guess so. I need 3 days off." There was a package of Kents in the breast pocket of Queems's sheer yellow shirt. He reached one out of the pocket without removing the packs, tweezing it out, and bit down morosely on the patented Micronite filter. He lit it with his desktop cricket. So do I, he said. Well, what's on your mind? I need 3 days, Halloran repeated. It's my boy. Queems's eyes dropped to Halloran's left hand, which was ringless. I've been divorced since 1964, Halloran said patiently. Dick, you know what the weekend situation is. We're full. To the gunnels. Even the cheap seats. We're even filled up in the Florida room on Sunday night. So take my watch, my wallet, my pension fund. Hell, you can even take my wife if you can stand the sharp edges. But please don't ask me for time off. What is he, sick? Yes, sir, Halloran said, still trying to visualize himself twisting in a cheap cloth hat and rolling his eyeballs. He's shot. Shot? Queems said. He put his Kent down in an ashtray which bore the emblem of Ole Miss, of which he was a business admin graduate. Yes, sir, Halloran said somberly. Hunting accident? No, sir, Halloran said, let his voice drop to a lower, huskier note. Jana, she's been living with this truck driver, a white man. He shot my boy. He's in a hospital in Denver, Colorado. Critical condition. How in the hell did you find out? I thought you were buying vegetables. Yes, sir, I was. He had stopped at the Western Union office just before coming here to reserve an Avis car at Stapleton Airport. Before leaving, he had swiped a Western Union flimsy. Now he took the folded and crumpled blank form from his pocket and flashed it before Queems's bloodshot eyes. He put it back in his pocket and, allowing his voice to drop another notch, said, Jana sent it. It was waiting in my letterbox when I got back just now. Jesus Christ, Queems said. There was a peculiar, tight expression of concern on his face, one Halloran was familiar with. It was as close to an expression of sympathy as a white man who thought of himself as good with the coloreds could get when the object was a black man or his mythical black son. Yeah, okay, well, you get going, Queems said. Baedeker can take over for 3 days, I guess. Well, the potboy can help out. Halloran nodded, letting his face get longer still. But the thought of the potboy helping out Baedeker made him grin inside. Even on a good day, Halloran doubted if the potboy could hit the urinal on the first squirt. I want to rebate back this week's pay, Halloran said. The whole thing. I know what a bind this putting you in, Mr. Queems, sir. Queems's expression got tighter still. It looked as if he might have a fishbone caught in his throat. Well, we can talk about that later. Well, you go on and pack. I'll talk to Baedeker. Want me to make you a plane reservation? No, sir, I'll do that. All right. Queems stood up, leaned sincerely forward, and inhaled a raft of ascending smoke from his Kent. He coughed heartily, his thin white face turning red. Halloran struggled hard to keep his somber expression. Well, I hope everything turns out, Dick. Call when you get word. I'll do that. They shook hands over the desk. Halloran made himself get down to the ground floor and across the hired help's compound before bursting into rich, head-shaking laughter. He was still grinning and mopping his streaming eyes with his handkerchief when the smell of oranges came thick and gagging, and the bolt followed it, striking him in the head, sending him back against the pink stucco wall in a drunken stagger. Please come, Dick, please come quick. He recovered a little at a time, and at last felt capable of climbing the outside stairs to his apartment. He kept the latch key under the rush-plated doormat, and when he reached down to get it, something fell out of his inner pocket and fell to the second-floor decking with a flat thump. His mind was still so much on the voice that it shivered through his head, and that for a moment he could only look at the blue envelope blankly, not knowing what it was. Then he turned it over, and the word "will" stared up at him in black, spidery letters. Oh my God, is it like that? He didn't know, but it could be. All week long, the thought of his own ending had been on his mind like a... Go on, say it. Like a premonition. Death? For a moment, his whole life seemed to flash before him, not in a historical sense, no topography of the ups and downs that Mrs. Halloran's third son Dick had lived through, but his life as it was now. Martin Luther King had told them that not long before the bullet took him down to his martyr's grave, that he had been to the mountain. Dick had not claimed that. No mountain. But he had reached a sunny plateau after years of struggle. He had good friends. He had all the references he would ever need to get a job anywhere. When he wanted... Wait, hang on. He had come to terms with his... He had come to terms... I'm going to read the last sentence. It didn't make any sense to me, but I'm going to read it. When he wanted fuck, why, he could find a friendly one with no questions asked and no big shitty struggle about what it all meant. He had come to terms with his blackness, happy terms. He was up past 60, and thank God he was cruising. Was he going to chance the end of that? The end of him? For 3 white people he didn't even know? But that was a lie, wasn't it? He knew the boy. They had shared each other the way good friends can even after 40 years of it. He knew the boy, and the boy knew him, because they each had a kind of searchlight in their heads, something they hadn't asked for, something they had just been given. Now you got a flashlight. He's the one with the searchlight. And sometimes that light, that shine, seemed like a pretty nice thing. You could pick the horses, or like the boy had said, you could tell your daddy where his trunk was when it turned up missing. But that was only dressing, the sauce on the salad. And down below there was as much bitter vetch in that salad as there was cool cucumber. You could taste pain and death and tears. And now the boy was stuck in that place. And he would go. For the boy. Because speaking to the boy, they had only been different colors when they used their mouths. So he would go. He would do what he could, because if he couldn't, the boy was going to die right inside his head. But because he was human, he could not help a bitter wish that the cup had never been passed this way. She had started to get out and come after him. He had been dumping a change of clothes into an overnight bag when the thought came to him, freezing him with the power of the memory as it always did when he thought of it. He tried to think of it as seldom as possible. The maid, Dolores Vickery her name was, had been hysterical. Had said some things to the other chambermaids, and worse still, to some of the guests. When the word got back to Ullman, as the silly quiff should have known it would do, he had fired her out of hand. She had come to Halloran in tears, not about being fired, but about the things she had seen in that second-floor room. She had gone into 217 to change the towels, she said, and there had been that Mrs. Massey lying dead in the tub. That, of course, was impossible. Mrs. Massey had been discreetly taken away the day before, and was even then winging her way back to New York in the shipping hold, instead of the first class she'd been accustomed to. Halloran hadn't liked Dolores much, but he had gone up to look that evening. The maid was an olive-complected girl of 23 who waited... Let's just put all the stuff in one chapter, Steve. She had a small shining, Halloran judged, really not more than a twinkle, A mousy-looking man and his escort, wearing a faded cloth coat, would come in for dinner, and Dolores would trade one of her tables for theirs. The mousy little man would leave a picture of Alexander Hamilton under his plate. Bad enough for the girl who had made the trade, but worse. Dolores would crow over it. She was lazy, a goof-off in an operation run by a man who allowed no goof-offs. She would sit in a linen closet, reading a confession magazine and smoking. But whenever Ullman went on one of his unscheduled prowls, and woe to the girl he caught resting her feet, he found her working industriously. Her magazine hidden under the sheets on a high shelf, her ashtray tucked safely into her uniform pocket. Yeah, Halloran thought. She'd been a goof-off and a sloven, and the other girls had resented her. But Dolores had had that little twinkle. It had always greased the skids for her. But what she had seen in 217 had scared her badly enough, so she was more than glad to pick up the walking papers Ullman had issued her and go. Why had she come to him? A shine knows a shine, Halloran thought, grinning at the pun. So he had gone up that night and had let himself into the room, which was to be reoccupied the next day. He had used the office pass key to get in, and if Ullman had caught him with that key, he would have joined Dolores Vickery in the unemployment line. The shower curtain around the tub had been drawn. He had pushed it back, but even more he did. He'd had a premonition of what he was going to see. Mrs. Massey, swollen and purple, lay soggily in the tub, which was half full of water. He had stood looking down at her, a pulse beating thickly in his throat. There had been other things at the Overlook, a bad dream that recurred at irregular intervals, some sort of costume party, and he was catering it in the Overlook's ballroom, and at the shout to unmask, everybody exposed faces, and those were the rotting insects. And there had been the hedge animals. Twice, maybe 3 times, he had, or thought he had, seen them move ever so slightly. That dog would seem to change from his sitting-up position to a slightly crouched one, and the lion seemed to move forward as if menacing the little tykes on the playground. Last year in May, Ullman had sent him up to the attic to look for the ornate set of fire tools that now sat beside the lobby fireplace. While he had been up there, the 3 light bulbs strung overhead had gone out, and he had lost his way back to the trap door. He had stumbled around for an unknown length of time, closer and closer to panic, barking his shins on boxes and bumping into things, with a stronger and stronger feeling that something was stalking him in the dark. Some great and frightening creature that had just oozed out of the woodwork when the lights went out. And when he had literally stumbled over the trapdoor's ring bolt, he had hurried down as fast as he could, leaving the trap open, sooty and disheveled, with a feeling of disaster barely averted. Later, Ullman had come down to the kitchen personally to inform him he had left the attic trap door open and the lights burning up there. Did Halloran think the guests wanted to go up there and play treasure hunt? Did he think electricity was free? And he suspected, no, he was nearly positive, that several of the guests had seen or heard things too. In the 3 years he had been there, the presidential suite had been booked 19 times. 6 of the guests who had put up there had left the hotel early, some of them looking markedly ill. Other guests had left other rooms with the same abruptness. One night in August of 1974, near dusk, a man who had won the bronze and silver stars in Korea, that man now sat on the boards of 3 major corporations and was said to have personally pink-slipped a famous TV news anchorman, unaccountably went into a fit of screaming hysterics on the putting green. And there had been dozens of children during Halloran's association with the Overlook who simply refused to go into the playground. One child had had a convulsion while playing in that concrete rings. But Halloran didn't know if that could be attributed to the Overlook's deadly siren song or not. Word had gone around among the help, that the child, the only daughter of a handsome movie actor, was a medically controlled epileptic who had simply forgotten her medicine that day. And so, staring down at the corpse of Mrs. Massey, he had been frightened, but not completely terrified. It was not completely unexpected. Terror came when she opened her eyes to disclose blank silver pupils and began to grin at him. Horror came when she had started to get out and come after him. He had fled, heart racing, and had not felt safe even with the door shut and locked behind him. In fact, he admitted to himself now as he zipped the flight bags shut, he had never felt safe anywhere in the Overlook again. And now the boy, calling, screaming for help. He looked at his watch. It was 5:30 p.m. He went to the apartment's door, remembered it would be heavy winter now in Colorado, especially up in the mountains, and went back to his closet. He pulled his long sheepskin-lined overcoat out of the polyurethane dry cleaning bag, put it over his arm. It was the only winter garment he owned. He turned off all the lights and looked around. Had he forgotten anything? Yes, one thing. He took the will out of his breast pocket and slipped it into the margin of the dressing table mirror. With luck, he would be back to get it. Sure, with luck. He left the apartment, locked the door behind him, put the key under the rush mat, and ran down the outside steps to his converted Cadillac. Halfway to Miami International, comfortably away from the switchboard where Queems or Queems's toadies were known to listen in, Halloran stopped at a shopping center laundromat and called United Airlines. Flights to Denver? Well, there was one due out at 6:36 p.m. Could the gentleman make that? Halloran looked at his watch, which showed 6:02. He said he could. What about vacancies on the flight? Well, just let me check. A clunking sound in his ear, followed by saccharine Montavani, which was supposed to make being on hold more pleasant. It didn't. Halloran danced from one foot to the other, alternating glances between his watch and a young girl with a sleeping baby in a hammock on her back unloading a coin-op Maytag. She was afraid she was going to get home later than she planned, and would the roast burn, and her husband, Mike, Matt, would he be mad? A minute passed, 2. He had just about made up his mind to drive ahead and take his chances when the canned-sounding voice of the flight reservations clerk came back on. There was an empty seat, a cancellation. It was in first class. Did that make any difference? Nope. He wanted it. Would that be cash or credit card? Oh, cash, baby, cash. I've got to fly. And the name was Halloran. 2 L's, 2 N's. Catch you later. He hung up and hurried toward the door. The girl's simple thought, worry for the roast, broadcast at him over and over until he thought he would go mad. Sometimes it was like that. For no reason at all, you would catch a thought completely isolated, completely pure and clear, and usually completely useless. He almost made it. He had the limo cranked up to 80, and the airport was actually in sight when one of Florida's finest pulled him over. Halloran unrolled the electric window and opened his mouth at the cop, who was flipping up pages in his citation book. "I know," the cop said comfortingly. "It's a funeral in Cleveland. Your father. It's a wedding in Seattle. Your sister. Fire in San Jose that wiped out your Gramps' candy store. Some really fine Cambodian red just waiting in a terminal locker in New York City. I love this piece of road just outside the airport. Even as a kid, story hour was my favorite part of school." "Listen, officer, my son is..." The only part of the story I can never figure out until the end, the officer said, finding the right page in his citation book, is the driver's license number of the offending motorist storyteller and his registration information. So be a nice guy. Let me peek. Halloran looked into the cop's calm blue eyes, debating telling my son is in critical condition story anyway, and decided that would just make things worse. This Smokey was no Queems. He dug out his wallet. Wonderful. Would you take them out for me, please? I just have to see how it's all going to come out in the end. Silently, Halloran took out his driver's license and his Florida registration and gave them to the traffic cop. That's very good. That's so good you win a present. What? Halloran asked hopefully. When I finish writing down these numbers, I'm going to let you blow up a little balloon for me. Oh, Jesus, Halloran moaned. Officer, my flight. Shh. Don't be naughty. Halloran closed his eyes. He got to the United desk at 6:49, hoping against hope that the flight had been delayed. He didn't even have to ask. The departure monitor over the incoming passenger's desk told the story. Flight 901 for Denver, due out at 6:36 Eastern Standard Time, had left at 6:40, 9 minutes before. Ah, shit, Dick Halloran said. Suddenly the smell of oranges, heavy and cloying. He had just time to reach the men's room before it came, deafening, terrified. Come, please, come, Dick, please, please come. Chapter 39. On the Stairs. One of the things they had sold to swell their liquid assets a little before moving from Vermont to Colorado was Jack's collection of 200 old rock and roll and R&B albums. They had gone at the yard sale for $1 apiece. One of these albums, and Danny's personal favorite, had been an Eddie Cochran double record set for 4 pages of bound-in liner notes by Lenny Kaye. Wendy had often been struck by Danny's fascination for this one particular album by a man-boy who had lived fast and died young. Had died, in fact, when she herself had only been 10 years old. Now, at 7:15, Mountain Time, as Dick Halloran was telling Queems about his ex-wife's white boyfriend, she came upon Danny sitting halfway at the stairs, up the stairs between the lobby and the first floor, tossing a red rubber ball from hand to hand and singing one of the songs from that album. His voice was low and tuneless. So I climb 1, 2, flight 3, flight 4, Danny sang. 5, flight 6, flight 7, flight more. When I get to the top, I'm too tired to rock. She came around him, sat down on one of the stair risers, and saw that his lower lip had swelled to twice its size, and there was dried blood on his chin. Her heart took a frightened leap in her chest, but she managed to speak neutrally. What happened, Doc? she asked, although she was sure she knew. Jack had hit him. Well, of course. That came next, didn't it? The wheels of progress. Sooner or later, they took you back to where you started from.
I called Tony, Danny said. In the bathroom. In the ballroom. I guess I fell off the chair. It doesn't hurt anymore. It just feels like my lip's too big. Is that what really happened? She asked, looking at him troubled. Daddy didn't do it, he answered. Not today.
She gazed at him, feeling eerie. The ball traveled from one hand to the other. He had read her mind. Her son had read her mind.
What? What did Tony tell you, Danny? It doesn't matter.
His face was calm, his voice chillingly indifferent.
Danny.
She gripped his shoulder harder than she had intended, but he didn't wince, or even try to shake her off. Oh, we are wrecking this boy. It's not just Jack, it's me too. And maybe it's not even just us. Jack's father, my mother, are they here too? Sure, why not? The place is lousy with ghosts anyway. Why not a couple more? Oh, Lord in heaven, he's like one of those suitcases they show on TV. Run over, drop from planes, going through factory crushers. Or Timex watch, takes a licking, keeps on ticking. Oh, Danny, I'm so sorry.
It doesn't matter,
he said again. The ball went from hand to hand.
Tony can't come anymore. They won't let him. He's licked. Who won't? The people in the hotel, he said.
He looked at her then, and his eyes weren't indifferent at all. They were deep and scared.
And the things in the hotel, there's all kinds of them. The hotel is stuffed with them. You can see? I don't want to see,
he said low, and then looked back at the rubber ball arcing from hand to hand.
But I can hear them sometimes late at night. They're like the wind, all sighing together. In the attic, the basement, the rooms, all over. I thought it was my fault because of the way I am. The key. The little silver key. Danny, don't upset yourself this way. But it's him too. It's Daddy and it's you. It wants all of us. It's tricking Daddy, it's fooling him, trying to make him think it wants him the most. It wants me the most, but it'll take all of us. If only that snowmobile. They wouldn't let him, Danny said in the same low voice. They made him throw part of it down into the snow. Far away. I dreamed it. And he knows that woman really isn't 217.
He looked at her with his dark, frightened eyes.
It doesn't matter whether you believe me or not.
She slipped an arm around him.
I believe you, Danny. Tell me the truth. Is Jack... Is he going to try and hurt us? They'll try to make him. I've been calling for Mr. Halloran. He said if I ever needed him, just call. And I have been. But it's awful hard. It makes me tired. And the worst part is I don't know if he's hearing me or not. I don't think he can call back because it's too far for him. And I don't know if it's too far for me or not. And tomorrow...
What about tomorrow? He shook his head.
Nothing.
Where is he now? She asked. Your daddy.
He's in the basement. I don't think he'll be up tonight.
She stood up suddenly.
Wait right here for me. 5 minutes.
The kitchen was cold and deserted under the overhead fluorescent bars. She went to the rack where the carving knives hung from their magnetized strips. She took the longest and sharpest, wrapped it in a dish towel, and left the kitchen, turning off the lights as she went. Danny sat on the stairs, his eyes following the course of his red rubber ball from hand to hand. He sang,
She lives on the 20th floor uptown. Elevator's broken down. So I walk 1, 2, flight 3, flight 4. Lulu, skip to my Lou. His singing broke off. He listened. Skip to my Lou, my darling. The voice was in his head, so much a part of him, so frighteningly close, that it might have been a part of his own thoughts. It was soft and infinitely shy, mocking him, seeming to say, "Oh yes, you'll like it here. Try it, you'll like it. Try it, you'll like it." Now his ears were open and he could hear them again, the gathering, ghosts or spirits, or maybe the hotel itself. A dreadful fun house where all the side shows ended in death, where all the specially painted boogies were really alive, where Hedges walked, where a small silver key could start the obscenity, soft and sighing, rustling like the endless winter wind that played under the eaves at night, the deadly lulling wind the summer tourist never heard. It was like the somnolent hum of summer wasps in a ground nest, sleepy, deadly, beginning to wake up. They were 10,000 feet high. Why is a raven like a writing desk? The higher, the fewer, of course. Have another cup of tea. It was a living sound, but not voices, not breath. A man of a philosophical bent might have called it the sound of souls. Dick Halloran's Nana, who had grown up on southern roads in the years before the turn of the century, would have called it Haunts. A psychic investigator might have a long name for it: psychic echo, psychokinesis, a telesmic sport. But to Danny, it was only the sound of the hotel, the old monster, creaking steadily and ever more closely around them. Halls that now stretched back through time as well as distance. Hungry shadows, unquiet guests who did not rest easily. In the darkened ballroom, the clock under glass struck 7:30 with a single musical note. A hoarse voice, made brutal with drink, shouted, "Unmask, let's fuck!" Wendy, halfway across the lobby, jerked to a standstill. She looked at Danny on the stairs, still tossing the ball from hand to hand. "Did you hear something?" Danny only looked at her with continued to toss the ball from hand to hand. There would be little sleep for them that night, although they slept together behind a locked door. And in the dark, his eyes open, Danny thought. He wants to be one of them and live forever. That's what he wants. Wendy thought, if I have to, I'll take him farther up. If we're going to die, I'd rather do it in the mountains. She had left the butcher knife still wrapped in the towel under the bed. She kept her hand close to it. They dozed off and on. The hotel creaked around them. Outside, snow had begun to spit down from a sky like lead. Chapter 40. In the basement. The boiler. The goddamn boiler. The thought came into Jack Torrance's mind full-blown, edged in bright warning red. On its heels, the voice of Watson. If you forget, he'll just creep, and like as not, you and your family will end up on the fucking moon. She's rated for 250, but she'll blow long before that now. And I'd be scared to come down and stand next to her at 180. He'd been down here all night, poring over the boxes of old records, possessed by a frantic feeling that time was getting short, and he would have to hurry.
Still, the vital clues, the connections that would make everything clear, eluded him. His fingers were yellow and grimy with crumbling old paper. And he became so absorbed he hadn't checked the boiler once. He dumped it at the previous evening around 6 o'clock when he first came down. It was now. He looked at his watch and jumped up, kicking over a stack of old invoices. Christ, it was 4:45 in the morning. Behind him, the furnace kicked on. The boiler was making a groaning, whistling sound. He ran to it. His face, which had become thinner in the last month or so, was now heavily shadowed with beard stubble, and he had a hollow concentration camp look. The boiler pressure gauge stood at 210 pounds per square inch. He fancied he could almost see the sides of the old patched and welded boiler heaving out with the lethal strain. She creeps. I'd be scared to come down and stand next to her at 180. Suddenly, a cold and tempting inner voice spoke to him. Let it go. Go get Wendy and Danny and get the fuck out of here. Let it blow sky high. He could visualize the explosion, a double thunderclap that would first rip the heart from this place, then the soul. The boiler would go with an orange-violet flash that would rain hot and burning shrapnel all over the cellar. In his mind, he could see the red-hot trinkets of metal careening from floor to walls to ceiling like strange billiard balls, whistling jagged death through the air. Some of them surely would whiz right through that stone arch, light on the old papers on the other side, and they would burn merry hell. Destroy the secrets, burn the clues. It's a mystery no living hand will ever solve. Then the gas explosion. A great rumbling crackle of flame. A giant pilot light that would turn the whole center of the hotel into a broiler. Stairs and hallways and ceilings and rooms aflame like the castle in the last reel of a Frankenstein movie. The flames spreading into the wings, hurrying up the black and blue twined carpets like eager guests. The silk wallpaper charring, curling. There were no sprinklers, only those outmoded hoses and no one to use them. And there wasn't a fire engine in the world that could get here before late March. Burn, baby, burn. In 12 hours, there would be nothing left but the bare bones. The needle on the gauge had moved up to 212. The boiler was creaking and groaning like an old woman trying to get out of bed. Hissing jets of steam had begun to play around the edges of old patches. Beads of solder had begun to sizzle. He didn't see, he didn't hear. Frozen with his hand on the valve that would dump off the pressure and damp the fire, Jack's eyes glittered from their sockets like sapphires. It's my last chance. The only thing not cashed in now was the life insurance policy he had taken out jointly with Wendy the summer between his first and second year at Stovington. $40,000 death benefit, double indemnity if he or she died in a train crash, plane crash, or fire. 7 come 11, die the secret death and win $100. A fire, $80,000. They would have time to get out, even if they were sleeping. They would have time to get out. He believed that. He didn't think the hedges or anything else would try to hold them back if the overlook was going up in flames. The needle inside the greasy, almost opaque dial had danced up to 215 pounds per square inch. Another memory occurred to him, a childhood memory. There had been a wasp's nest in the lower branch of their apple tree behind the house. One of his older brothers, he couldn't remember which one now, had been stung while swinging in the old tire Daddy had hung from one of the tree's lower branches. It had been late summer, when wasps tend to be at their ugliest. Their father, just home from work, dressed in his whites, the smell of beer hanging around his face in a fine mist, and gathered all three boys, Brett, Mike, and little Jackie, and told them he was going out to get rid of the wasps. "Now watch," he had said, smiling and staggering a little. He hadn't been using the cane then. The collision with the milk truck was years in the future. "Maybe you'll learn something. My father showed me this." He had raked a big pile of rain-dampened leaves under the branch where the wasp's nest had rested, a deadlier fruit than the shrunken but tasty apples their tree usually produced in late September, which was then still half a month away. He lit the leaves. The day was clear and windless. The leaves smoldered but didn't really burn, and they made a smell, a fragrance, that had echoed back to him each fall when men in Saturday pants and light windbreakers raked leaves together and burned them. A sweet smell with a bitter undertone, rich and evocative. The smoldering leaves produced great rafts of smoke that drifted up to obscure the nest. Their father had let the leaves smolder all that afternoon, drinking beer on the porch and dropping the empty Black Label cans into his wife's plastic floor bucket, while his two older sons flanked him and little Jackie sat on the steps at his feet, playing with his bolo bouncer and singing monotonously over and over, "Your cheating heart will make you weep. Your cheating heart is gonna tell on you." At 6:15, just before supper, Daddy... Why is everybody toneless when they sing in this novel? At 6:15, just before supper, Daddy had gone out of the apple tree with his sons grouped carefully behind him. In one hand, he had a garden hoe. He knocked the leaves apart, leaving little clots spread around to smolder and die. Then he reached the hoe handle up, weaving and blinking, and after 2 or 3 tries, he knocked the nest to the ground. The boys fled for the safety of the porch, but Daddy only stood over the nest, swaying and blinking down at it. Jackie crept back to see. A few wasps were crawling sluggishly over the paper terrain of their property. But they were not trying to fly. From the inside of the nest, the black and alien place, came a never-to-be-forgotten sound. A low, somnolent buzz, like the sound of high-tension wires.
"Why don't they try to sting you, Daddy?"
he had asked. "The smoke makes them drunk, Jackie. Go get my gas can." He ran to fetch it. Daddy doused the nest with amber gasoline. "Now step away, Jackie, unless you want to lose your eyebrows." He had stepped away. From somewhere in the voluminous folds of his white overblouse, Daddy had produced a wooden kitchen match. He lit it with his thumbnail and flung it to the nest. There had been a white-orange explosion, almost soundless in its ferocity. Daddy had stepped away, cackling wildly. The wasp's nest had gone up in no time. "Fire!" Daddy had said, turning to Jackie with a smile. "Fire will kill anything." After supper, the boys had come out in the day's waning light to stand solemnly around the charred and blackened nest. From the hot interior had come the sound of wasp bodies popping like corn. The pressure gauge stood at 220. A low iron wailing sound was building up in the guts of the thing. Jets of steam stood out erect in 100 places like porcupine quills. "Fire will kill anything." Jack suddenly started. He had been dozing off, and he had almost dozed himself right into Kingdom Come. What in God's name had he been thinking of? Protecting the hotel was his job. He was the caretaker. A sweat of terror sprang to his hands so quickly that at first he missed his grip on the large valve. Then he curled his fingers around its spokes. He whirled at one turn, two, three. There was a giant hiss of steam, dragon's breath. A warm tropical mist rose from beneath the boiler and veiled him. For a moment he could no longer see the dial, but thought he must have waited too long. The groaning, clinking sound inside the boiler increased, followed by a series of heavy rattling sounds and the wrenching screech of metal. When some of the steam blew away, he saw that the pressure gauge had dropped back to 200 and was still sinking. The jets of steam escaping around the soldered patches began to lose their force. The wrenching, grinding sounds began to diminish. 190, 180, 175. He was going downhill, going 90 miles an hour, when the whistle broke into a scream. He didn't think it would blow now. Press was down to 160. I found him in the wreck with his hand on the throttle. He was scalded to death by the steam. He stepped away from the boiler, breathing hard, trembling. He looked at his hands and saw the blisters were already rising on his palms. Hell with blisters, he thought, and laughed shakily. He had almost died with his hand on the throttle like Casey the engineer in the wreck of the old 97. Worse still, he would have killed the Overlook, the final crashing failure. He had failed as a teacher, a writer, a husband, and a father. He had even failed as a drunk. But you couldn't do much better in the old failure category than to blow up the building you were supposed to be taking care of. This was no ordinary building by no means. Christ, but he needed a drink. The press had dropped down to 80 psi. Cautiously, wincing a little at the pain in his hands, he closed the dump valve again. But from now on, the boiler would have to be watched more closely than ever. It might have been seriously weakened. He wouldn't trust it at more than 100 psi for the rest of the winter. And if they were being a little chilly, they would just have to grin and bear it. He had broken 2 of the blisters. His hands throbbed like rotten teeth. A drink. A drink would fix him up. And there wasn't a thing in the goddamn house besides cooking sherry. At this point, a drink would be medicinal. Well, that was just it, by God. An anesthetic. He had done his duty, and now he could use a little anesthetic. Something stronger than Excedrin. But there was nothing. He remembered bottles glittering in the shadows. He had saved the hotel. The hotel would want to reward him. He felt sure of that. He took his handkerchief out of his back pocket and went to the stairs. He rubbed at his mouth. Just a little drink, just one, to ease the pain. He had served the Overlook, and now the Overlook would serve him. He was sure of it. His feet on the stair risers were quick and eager. The hurrying steps of a man who has come home from a long and bitter war. It was 5:20 a.m., Mountain Standard Time. Chapter 41. Daylight. Danny awoke with a muffled gasp from a terrible dream. There had been an explosion. A fire. The overlook was burning up. He and his mommy were watching it from the front lawn. Mommy had said,
"Look, Danny, look at the hedges."
He looked at them, and they were all dead. Their leaves had turned a suffocant brown. The tightly packed branches showed through like the skeletons of half-dismembered corpses. And then his daddy had burst out of the overlook's big double doors, and he was burning like a torch. His clothes were in flames. His skin had acquired a dark and sinister tan that was growing darker by the moment. His hair was a burning bush. That was when he woke up, his throat tight with fear. His hands clutching at the sheet and blankets. Had he screamed? He looked over at his mother. Wendy lay on her side, the blankets up to her chin, a sheaf of straw-colored hair lying against her cheek. She looked like a child herself. No, he hadn't screamed. Lying in bed, looking upward, the nightmare began to drain away. He had a curious feeling that some great tragedy, fire, explosion, had been averted by inches. He let his mind drift out, searching for his daddy, and found him standing somewhere below, in the lobby. Danny pushed a little harder, trying to get inside his father. It was not good, because Daddy was thinking about the bad thing. He was thinking how, God, just one or two would be, I don't care. Sun's over the yard arms somewhere in the world. Remember how we used to say that, Al? Gin and tonic, bourbon with just a dash of bitter, scotch and soda, rum and coke, tweedledum and tweedledee. A drink for me and a drink for thee. The Martians have landed somewhere in the world. Princeton or Houston or Stokely on Carmichael, some fucking place after all. 'Tis the season, and none of us are... Get out of his mind, you little shit! He recoiled in terror from that mental voice, his eyes widening, his hands tightening into claws on the counterpane. It hadn't been the voice of his father, but a clever mimic. A voice he knew, hoarse, brutal, yet underpointed with a vacuous sort of humor. Was it so near, then? He threw the covers back and swung his feet out onto the floor. He kicked his slippers out from under the bed and put them on. He went to the door and pulled it open and hurried up the main corridor, his slippered feet whispering on the nap of the carpet runner. He turned the corner. There was a man on all fours, halfway down the corridor, between him and the stairs. Danny froze. The man looked up at him. His eyes were tiny and red. He was dressed in some sort of silvery spangled costume. A dog costume, Danny realized. Protruding from the rump of this strange creation was a long and floppy tail with a puff on the end. A zipper ran up the back of the costume to the neck. To the left of him was a dog's or a wolf's head, blank eye sockets above the muzzle. The mouth open in a meaningless snarl that showed the rug's black and blue pattern between fangs that appeared to be paper mache. The man's mouth and chin and cheeks were smeared with blood. He began to growl at Danny. He was grinning, but the growl was real. It was deep in his throat, a chilling, primitive sound. Then he began to bark. His teeth were also stained red. He began to crawl toward Danny, dragging his boneless tail behind him. The costume's dog's head lay unheeded on the carpet, glaring vacantly over Danny's shoulder.
"Let me by," Danny said.
"I'm going to eat you, little boy,"
the dog man answered, and suddenly a fusillade of barks came from his grinning mouth. They were human imitations, but the savagery in them was real. The man's hair was dark, greased with sweat from his confining costume. There was a mixture of scotch and champagne on his breath. Danny flinched back, but didn't run.
"Let me by."
"Not by the hair on my chinny chin chin,"
the dog man replied. His small red eyes were fixed attentively on Danny's face. He continued to grin.
"I'm gonna eat you up, little boy. I think I'll start with your plump little cock."
He began to prance skittishly forward, making little leaps and snarling. Danny's nerve broke. He fled back into the short hallway that led to their quarters, looking back over his shoulder. There was a series of mixed howls and barks and growls, broken by slurred mutterings and giggles. Danny stood in the hallway, trembling.
"Get it up,"
the drunken dog man cried out from around the corner. Whoa. Are we still here? His voice was both violent and despairing.
"Get it up. Harry, you bitch bastard. I don't care how many casinos and airlines and movie companies you own. I know what you like, the privacy of your own home. Get it up. I'll huff and I'll puff until Harry Derwent's all blown down."
He ended with a long, chilling howl that seemed to turn into a scream of rage and pain just before it dwindled off. Danny turned apprehensively to the closed bedroom door at the end of the hallway and walked quietly down to it. He opened it and poked his head through. His mommy was sleeping in exactly the same position. No one was hearing this but him. He closed the door softly and went back up to the intersection of their corridor and the main hall, hoping the dog man would be gone, the way the blood on the walls of the presidential suite had been gone. He peeked around the corner carefully. The man in the dog costume was still there. He had put his head back on and was now prancing on all fours by the stairwell, chasing his tail. He occasionally leaped off the rug and came down, making dog grunts in his throat.
"Woof, woof. Bow, wow, wow. Bow, wow, wow. Bow, wow.
These sounds came hollowly out of the man's mask's stylized, snarling mouth, and among them were sounds that might have been sobs or laughter. Danny went back to the bedroom and sat down on his cot, covering his eyes with his hands. The hotel was running things now. Maybe at first the things that had happened had only been accidents. Maybe at first the things that he had seen or really were like scary pictures that couldn't hurt him. But now the hotel was controlling those things, and they could hurt. The Overlook hadn't wanted him to go to his father. That might spoil all the fun. So it had put the dog man in his way, just as it had put the hedge animals between them and the road. But his daddy could come here, and sooner or later his daddy would. He began to cry, the tears rolling silently down his cheeks. It was too late. They were going to die, all three of them. And when the Overlook opened next late spring, they would be right here to greet the guests along with the rest of the spooks. The woman in the tub, the dog man, the horrible dark thing that had been in the cement tunnel. Well, they would be...
Stop. Stop that now.
He knuckled the tears furiously from his eyes. He would try as hard as he could to keep that from happening. Not to himself, not to his daddy and mommy. He would try as hard as he could. He closed his eyes and sent his mind out in a high, hard crystal bolt.
Dick, please come. Quick, we're in bad trouble, Dick. We need...
And suddenly, in the darkness behind his eyes, the thing that chased him down the Overlook's dark halls in his dreams was there. Right there. A huge creature dressed in white, its prehistoric club raised over its head. "I'll make you stop it, you goddamn puppy. I'll make you stop it because I am your father."
No!
He jerked back to the reality of the bedroom, his eyes wide and staring, the screams tumbling helplessly from his mouth, as his mother bolted away, clutching the sheet to her breasts.
No, Daddy, no, no, no!
And they both heard the vicious, descending swing of the invisible club, cutting the air somewhere very close, then fading away to silence as he ran to his mother and hugged her, trembling like a rabbit in a snare. The Overlook was not going to let him call Dick. That might spoil the fun, too. They were alone. Outside, the snow came harder, curtaining them off from the world. Chapter 42. Midair. Dick Halloran's flight was called at 6:45 a.m. and the boarding clerk held him by gate 31, shifting his flight bag nervously from hand to hand until the last call at 6:55. They were both looking for a man named Carlton Vecker, the only passenger on TWA's Flight 196 from Miami to Denver who hadn't checked in. "Okay," the clerk said, and issued Halloran a blue first-class boarding pass. "You lucked out. You can board, sir." Halloran hurried up the enclosed boarding ramp and let the mechanically grinning stewardess near his pass off and give him the stub. Oh, tear. She tore his pass off and gave him the stub.
"We're serving breakfast on the flight,"
the stew said.
"if you'd like."
"Just coffee, babe," he said, and went down the aisle to a seat in the smoking section. He kept expecting the no-show Vecker to pop through the door like a jack-in-the-box last second. The woman in the seat by the window was reading, "You can be your own best friend," with a sour, unbelieving expression on her face. Halloran buckled his seatbelt and then wrapped his large black hands around the seat's armrests and promised the absent Carlton Vecker that it would take him and 5 strong TWA flight attendants to drag him out of this seat. He kept his eye on his watch It dragged off the minutes to the 7 o'clock takeoff time with maddening slowness. At 7:05, the stewardess informed them that there would be a slight delay while the ground crew rechecked one of the latches on the cargo door. "Shit for brains," Dick Halloran muttered. The sharp-faced woman turned her sour, unbelieving expression on him and then went back to her book. He had spent the night at the airport, going from counter to counter, United, American, TWA, Continental, Braniff, haunting the ticket clerks. Sometime after midnight, drinking his 8th or 9th cup of coffee in the canteen, he had decided he was being an asshole to have taken this whole thing on his own shoulders. There were authorities. He had gone down to the nearest bank of telephones. After talking to 3 different operators, he had gotten the emergency number off the Rocky Mountain National Park Authority. The man who answered the telephone sounded utterly worn out. Halloran had given a false name and said there was trouble at the Overlook Hotel, west of Sidewinder. Bad trouble. He was put on hold. The ranger, Halloran assumed he was a ranger, came back on in about 5 minutes.
"Well, they've got a CB," the ranger said.
"Sure they got a CB," Halloran said.
"Well, we haven't had a Mayday call from them."
"Man, that don't matter.
Exactly what kind of trouble are they in, Mr. Howell? Mr. Hall?
Well, there's a family. The caretaker and his family. I think maybe he's gone a little nuts, you know. I think maybe he might hurt his wife and his little boy."
"May I ask how you've come to this information, sir?"
Halloran closed his eyes. "What's your name, fella?"
"Tom Staunton, sir."
"Well, Tom, I know. Now I'll be just as straight with you as I can be. There's bad trouble up there. Maybe killing bad. Do you dig what I'm trying to say?"
"Mr. Hall, I really have to know how you—"
"Look," Halloran had said, "I'm telling you I know. A few years back there was a fellow up there named Grady. He killed his wife and 2 daughters and then pulled the string on himself. I'm telling you it's going to happen again if you guys don't haul your asses out there and stop it."
"Mr. Hall, you're not calling from Colorado."
"No, but what difference?"
"If you're not in Colorado, you're not in CB range of the Overlook Hotel. If you're not in CB range, you can't possibly have been in contact with the, faint rattle of papers, the Torrance family. While I had you on hold, I tried to telephone. It's out, which is nothing unusual. There are still 25 miles of above-ground telephone wires between the hotel and the Sidewinder switching station. My conclusion is that you must be some sort of crank."
"Oh, man, you stupid." But his despair was too great to find a noun to go with the adjective. Suddenly, illumination. "Well, call them," he cried.
"Sir?"
"You got the CB. They got the CB. So call them. Call them and ask them what's up." There was a brief silence and the humming of long-distance wires. "You tried that too, didn't you?" Halloran asked. "That's why you had me on hold so long. Well, you tried the phone, then you tried the CB, and you didn't get nothing. But you don't think nothing's wrong. What are you guys doing up there? Sitting on your asses and playing gin rummy?"
"No, we're not," Staunton said angrily.
Halloran was relieved at the sound of anger in the voice. For the first time, he felt he was speaking to a man and not to a recording.
"I'm the only man here, sir. Every other ranger in the park, plus game wardens, plus volunteers, are up in Hasty Notch, risking their lives because 3 stupid assholes with 6 months' experience decided to try the north face of King's Ram. They're stuck halfway up there, and maybe they'll get down, and maybe they won't.
There are two choppers up there, and the men who are flying them are risking their lives because it's night here and it's starting to snow. So if you're still having trouble putting it all together, I'll give you a hand with it. Number one, I don't have anybody to send to the Overlook. Number two, the Overlook isn't a priority here. What happens in the park is a priority. Number three, the daybreak, neither one of those choppers will be able to fly because it's going to snow like crazy, according to the National Weather Service. Do you understand the situation?
Yeah, Halloran had said softly. I understand.
Now my guess as to why I couldn't raise them on the CB is very simple. I don't know what time it is where you are, but out here it's 9:30. I think they may have turned it off and gone to bed. Now if you...
Good luck with your climbers, man, Halloran said. But I want you to know that they're not the only ones who are stuck up high because they didn't know what they were getting into. He had hung up the phone. At 7:20 a.m., the TWA 747 backed lumberingly out of its stall, turned and rolled out toward the runway. Halloran let out a long, soundless exhale. Carlton Vecker, wherever you are, eat your heart out. Flight 196 parted company with the ground at 7:28, and at 7:31, as it gained altitude, the thought pistol went off in Dick Halloran's head again. His shoulders hunched uselessly against the smell of oranges and then jerked spasmodically. His forehead wrinkled. His mouth drew down in a grimace of pain.
Dick, please come quick. We're in bad trouble, Dick. We need...
And that was all. It was suddenly gone. No fading out this time. The communication had been chopped off cleanly, as if with a knife. It scared him. His hands, still clutching the seat rests, had gone almost white. His mouth was dry. Something had happened to the boy. He was sure of it. If anyone could hurt that little child...
Do you always react so violently to takeoffs?
He looked around. It was the woman in the horn-rimmed glasses. Oh, it wasn't that, Halloran said. I've got a steel plate in my head. From Korea. Every now and then it gives me a twinge. Vibrates, don't you know? Scrambles the signal.
Is that so?
Yes, ma'am.
It is the line soldier who ultimately pays for any foreign intervention,
the sharp-faced woman said grimly. Is that so?
It is. This country must swear off its dirty little wars. The CIA has been at the root of every dirty little war. America has fought it in this century. The CIA and dollar diplomacy.
She opened her book and began to read. The no smoking sign went off. Halloran watched the receding land and wondered if the boy was all right. He had developed an affectionate feeling for that boy, although his folks hadn't seemed all that much. He hoped to God they were watching out for Danny. Chapter 43. Drinks on the House. Jack stood in the dining room just outside the Batwing doors leading into the Colorado Lounge. His head cocked, listening. He was smiling faintly. Around him he could hear the Overlook Hotel coming to life. It was hard to say just how he knew. But he guessed it wasn't greatly different from the perceptions Danny had had from time to time, like father, like son, Wasn't that how it was popularly expressed? It wasn't a perception of sight or sound, although it was very near to those things. Separated from those senses of the flimsiest, let me get this right, filmiest of perceptual curtains. It was as if another overlook now lay scant inches beyond this one, separated from the real world, if there is such a thing as a real world, Jack thought, but gradually coming into balance with it. He was reminded of the 3D movies he'd seen as a kid. If you looked at the screen without the special glasses, you saw a double image. The sort of thing he was feeling now. But when you put the glasses on, it made sense. All the hotel's eras were together now. All but this current one, the Torrance era. And this would be together with the rest very soon now. Well, that was good. Well, that was very good. He could almost hear the self-important ding, ding of the silver-plated bell on the registration desk, summoning bellboys to the front, as men in the fashionable flannels of the 1920s checked in, and men in fashionable 1940s double-breasted pinstripes checked out. There would be 3 nuns sitting in front of the fireplace as they waited for the checkout line to thin. Standing behind them, Natalie dressed with diamond stick pins holding their blue and white figured ties, Charles Grondin and Vito Gianelli discussed profit and loss, life and death. There was a dozen trucks in the loading bays out back, some laid one over the other, like bad time exposures. In the East Wing ballroom, a dozen different business conventions were going on at the same time, within temporal centimeters of each other. There was a costume ball going on. There were soirees, wedding receptions, birthday and anniversary parties. Men talking about Neville Chamberlain and the Archduke of Austria. Music, laughter, drunkenness, hysteria. Little love, not here, but a steady undercurrent of sensuousness. And he could almost hear all of them together, drifting through the hotel and making a graceful cacophony. In the dining room, where he stood, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 70 years were all being served simultaneously just behind him. He could almost He could hear him. Faintly as yet, but clearly. The way one can hear thunder miles off on a summer's hot day. He could hear all of them. Beautiful strangers. He was becoming aware of them as they must have been aware of him from the very start. All the rooms of the Overlook were occupied this morning. Full house. Beyond the bat wings, a low murmur of conversation drifted and swirled like lazy cigarette smoke. More sophisticated, more private. Low, throaty female laughter. The kind that seems to vibrate in a fairy ring around the viscera and the genitals. The sound of a cash register. His window softly lighted in the hall, the warm half-dark, ringing up the price of a gin Ricky, a Manhattan, a Depression bomber, a slow gin fizz, zombie. The jukebox, pouring out its drinkers' melodies, each one overlapping the other in time. He pushed the bat wings open and stepped through. "Hello, boys," Jack Torrance said softly. "I've been away, but now I'm back." "Good evening, Mr. Torrance," Lloyd said, genuinely pleased. "It's good to see you." "It's good to be back, Lloyd," he said gravely, hooked his leg over a stool between a man in a sharp blue suit and a bleary-eyed woman in a black dress who was peering into the depths of a Singapore sling.
What will it be, Mr. Torrance?
Martini, he said with great pleasure. He looked at the back bar with its rows of dimly gleaming bottles capped with their silver siphons. Jim Beam, Wild Turkey, Gilbey's, Sherrod's, Private Label, Toro, Seagram's, and home again. One large Martian, if you please, he said. They've landed somewhere in the world, Lloyd. He took his wallet out, laid a 20 carefully on the bar. As Lloyd made his drink, Jack looked over his shoulder. Every booth was occupied. Some of the occupants were dressed in costumes. A woman in a gauzy harem pants and a rhinestone-sparkled brassiere. A man with a fox head rising slyly out of his evening dress. A man in a silvery dog outfit who was tickling the nose of a woman in a sarong with a puff on the end of his long tail, to the general amusement of all.
No charge to you, Mr. Torrance,
Lloyd said, putting the drink down on Jack's 20.
Your money is no good here. Orders from the manager.
Manager? A faint unease came over him. Nevertheless, he picked up the martini glass and swirled it, watching the olive at the bottom bob slightly in the drink's chilly depths.
Of course, the manager.
Lloyd's smile broadened, but his eyes were socketed in shadow, and his skin was horribly white, like the skin of a corpse.
Later, he expects to see your son's well-being himself. He's very interested in your son. Danny is a talented boy.
The juniper fumes of the gin were pleasantly maddening. They also seemed to be blurring his reason. Danny? What was all this about Danny? And what was he doing in a bar with a drink in his hand? He had taken the pledge. He had gone on the wagon. He had sworn off. What could they want with his son? What could they want with Danny? Wendy and Danny weren't in it. He tried to see into Lloyd's shadowed eyes, but it was too dark. Too dark. It was like trying to read emotion into the empty orbs of a skull. Well, it's me they must want, isn't it? I'm the one. Not Danny. Not Wendy. I'm the one who loves it here. Well, they wanted to leave. I'm the one who took care of the snowmobile. Went through the old records. Dumped the press on the boiler. Lied. Practically sold my soul. What can they want with him? Where is the manager? He tried to ask it casually, but his words seemed to come out between lips already numbed by the first drink, like words from a nightmare rather than those in a sweet dream. Lloyd only smiled. What do you want with my son? Danny's not in this, is he? He heard the naked plea in his own voice. Lloyd's face seemed to be running, changing, becoming something pestilent. The white skin becoming a hepatitic yellow, crackling. Red sores erupting on the skin, bleeding foul-smelling liquid. Droplets of blood spring out on Lloyd's forehead like sweat. Somewhere a silver chime was striking the quarter hour. Unmask. Unmask.
Drink your drink, Mr. Torrance,
Lloyd said softly.
It isn't a matter that concerns you. Not at this point.
He picked his drink up again, raised it to his lips, hesitated. He heard the hard, horrible snap as Danny's arm broke. He saw the bicycle flying brokenly up over the hood of Al's car, starring the windshield. He saw a single wheel lying in the road, twisted spokes pointing into the sky like jags of piano wire. Piano? Sure. He became aware that all conversation had stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. They were all looking at him expectantly, silently. The man beside the woman in the sarong had removed his fox head. Jack saw that it was Horace Derwent, his pallid blonde hair spilling across his forehead. Everyone at the bar was watching too. The woman beside him was looking at him closely, as if trying to focus. Her dress had slipped off one shoulder, and looking down, he could see a loosely puckered nipple capping one sagging breast. Looking back at her face, he began to think that this might be the woman from 217. The one who had tried to strangle Danny. On his other hand, the man in the sharp blue suit had removed a small pearl-handled .32 from his jacket pocket and was idly spinning it on the bar, like a man with Russian roulette on his mind. He realized the words were not passing through his frozen vocal cords and tried again. I want to see the manager. I don't think he understands. My son's not part of this.
Mr. Torrance,
Lloyd said, his voice coming with hideous gentleness from inside his plague-riddled face.
You will meet the manager in due time. He has, in fact, decided to make you his agent in this matter. Now drink your drink.
Drink your drink, they all echoed. Drink your drink. He picked it up with a badly trembling hand. It was raw gin. He looked into it, and looking was like drowning. The woman beside him began to sing in a flat, dead voice. Roll out the barrel, and we'll have a barrel of fun. Lloyd picked it up. Then the man in the blue suit, the dog man, joined in, thumping one paw against the table. Now's the time to roll the barrel. Derwent added his voice to the rest. A cigarette was cocked in one corner of his mouth at a jaunty angle. His right arm was around the shoulders of the woman in the sarong, and his right hand was gently and absently stroking her right breast. He was looking at the dog man with amused contempt as he sang, because the gang's all here. Jack brought the drink to his mouth and downed it in 3 long gulps. The gin highballing down his throat like a moving van in a tunnel, exploding in his stomach, rebounding up to his brain in one leap where it seized hold of him with a final convulsing fit of the shakes. When that passed off, he felt fine. Do it again, please, he said, pushed the empty glass toward Lloyd.
Yes, sir,
Lloyd said, taking the glass. Lloyd looked perfectly normal again. The olive-skinned man had put his .32 away. The woman on his right was staring into her Singapore sling again. One breast was wholly exposed now, leaning on the bar's leather buffer. A vacuous, crooning noise came from her slack mouth. The loom of conversation had begun again, weaving and weaving. His new drink appeared in front of him. Muchas gracias, Lloyd, he said, picking it up.
Always a pleasure to serve you, Mr. Torrance,
Lloyd smiled. You were always the best of 'em, Lloyd.
Why, thank you, sir.
He drank slowly this time, letting it trickle down his throat, tossing a few peanuts down the chute for good luck. The drink was gone in no time, and he ordered another. "Mr. President, I've met the Martians. I'm pleased to report they're friendly." While Lloyd fixed another, he began searching his pockets for a quarter to put in the jukebox. He thought of Danny again, but Danny's face was pleasantly fuzzed and nondescript now. He had hurt Danny once, but that had been before he had learned how to handle his liquor. Those days were behind him now. He'd never hurt Danny again. Not for the world. Chapter 44. Conversations at the party. He was dancing with a beautiful woman. He had no idea what time it was, how long he had spent in the Colorado Lounge, or how long he had been there in the ballroom. Time had ceased to matter. He had vague memories, listening to a man who had once been a successful radio comic, and then a variety star in TV's infant days, telling a very long and very hilarious joke about incest between Siamese twins. Seeing the woman in the harem pants and the sequin bra do a slow and sinuous striptease to some bumping and grinding music from the jukebox seemed it had been David Rose's theme music from The Stripper. Crossing the lobby is one of three, the other two men in evening dress that predated the 20s, all of them singing about the stiff patch on Rosie O'Grady's knickers. He seemed to remember looking out the big double doors and seeing Japanese lanterns strung in graceful curving arcs that followed the sweep of the driveway. Well, they gleamed in soft pastel colors like dusky jewels. The big glass globe on the porch ceiling was on, and night insects bumped and flittered against it. And a part of him, perhaps the last tiny spark of sobriety, tried to tell him that it was 6 a.m. on a morning in December. Time had been canceled. The arguments against insanity fall through with a soft shirring sound. Layer on layer. Who was that? Some poet he had read as an undergraduate. Some undergraduate poet who is now selling washers in Wausau or insurance in Indianapolis. Perhaps an original thought. It didn't matter. The night is dark. The stars are high. A disembodied custard pie is floating in the sky. He giggled helplessly. "What's funny, honey?" And here he was again, in the ballroom. The chandelier was lit and couples were circling all around them, some in costume and some not, to the smooth sounds of some post-war band. But which war? Can you be certain? No, of course not. He was certain of only one thing. He was dancing with a beautiful woman. She was tall and auburn-haired, dressed in clinging white satin. She was dancing close to him, her breasts pressed softly and sweetly against his chest. Her white hand was entwined in his. She was wearing a small and sparkly cat's eye mask, and her hair had been brushed over to one side in a soft and gleaming fall that seemed to pool in the valley between their touching shoulders. Her dress was full-skirted, but he could feel her thighs against his legs from time to time, and had become more and more sure that she was smooth and powdered and naked under her dress.
The better to feel your erection with, my dear.
And he was sporting a regular rail spike. If it offended her, she concealed it well. She snuggled even closer to him. "Nothing funny, honey," he said and giggled again.
I like you,
she whispered, and he thought that her scent was like lilies, secret and hidden in cracks furred with green moss, places where sunshine is short and shadows long. "I like you too."
Oh, we can go upstairs if you want. I'm supposed to be with Harry, but he'll never notice. He's too busy teasing poor Roger.
The number ended. There was a spatter of applause, and then the band swung into Mood and Indigo, with scarcely a pause. Jack looked over her bare shoulder and saw Derwent standing by the refreshment table. The girl in the sarong was with him. There were bottles of champagne and ice buckets ranged along the white lawn covering the table, and Derwent held a foaming bottle in his hand. A knot of people had gathered, laughing. In front of Derwent and the girl in the sarong, Roger capered grotesquely on all fours, his tail dragging limply behind him. He was barking.
Speak, boy, speak, Harry Derwent cried.
Roger responded. Everyone clapped. A few of the men whistled.
Now sit up, doggy.
Roger clambered up on his haunches. The muzzle of his mask was frozen in its eternal snarl. Inside the eye holes, Roger's eyes rolled with frantic, sweaty hilarity. He held his arms out, dangling the paws. Derwent upended the bottle of champagne, and it fell in a foamy Niagara into the upturned mask. Roger made frantic slurping sounds, and everyone applauded again. Some of the women screamed with laughter.
Isn't Harry a card?
His partner asked him, pressing close again.
Everyone says so. He's AC/DC, you know. Poor Roger's only DC. He spent a weekend with Harry in Cuba once. Months ago. Now he follows Harry everywhere, wagging his little tail behind him.
She giggled. The shy scent of lilies drifted up.
But of course Harry never goes back for seconds. Not on his DC side, anyway. And Roger is just wild. Harry told him if he came to the masked ball as a doggy, a cute little doggy, he might reconsider. And Roger is such a silly that his...
The number ended. There was more applause. The band members were filing down for a break.
Excuse me, sweetness, she said. There's someone I must... Darla, you dear girl, where have you been?
She wove her way into the eating, drinking throng, and he gazed after her stupidly, wondering how they had happened to be dancing together in the first place. He didn't remember. Incidents seemed to have occurred with no connections. First here, then there, then everywhere. His head was spinning. He smelled lilies and juniper berries. Up by the refreshment table, Derwent was now holding a tiny triangular sandwich over Roger's head and urging him, to the general merriment of the onlookers, to do a somersault. The dog mask was turned upward. The silver sides of the dog costume billowed in and out. Roger suddenly leaped, tucking his head under, and tried to roll in midair. His leap was too low and too exhausted. He landed awkwardly on his back, rapping his head smartly on the tiles. A hollow groan drifted all out of the dog mask. Derwent led the applause.
Try again, doggy. Try again.
The onlookers took up the chant.
Try again! Try again!
And Jack staggered off the other way, feeling vaguely ill. He almost fell over the drinks cart that was being wheeled along by a low-browed man in a white mess jacket. His foot rapped the lower chromed shelf of the cart. The bottles and siphons on top chattered together musically. "Sorry," Jack said thickly. He suddenly felt closed in and claustrophobic. He wanted to get out. He wanted the Overlook back the way it had been, free of these unwanted guests. His place was not honored as the true opener of the way. He was only another of the 10,000 cheering extras, a doggy rolling over and sitting up on command. "Quite all right," the man in white mess jacket said. The polite, clipped English coming from that thug's face was surreal. "A drink?" "A martini." From behind him, another comber of laughter broke. Roger was howling to the tune of Home on the Range. Someone was picking out accompaniment on the Steinway Baby Grand. "Here you are." The frosty cold glass was pressed into his hand. Jack drank gratefully, feeling the gin hit and crumble away the first inroads of sobriety. "Is it all right, sir?" "It's fine." "Thank you, sir." The cart began to roll again. Jack suddenly reached out and touched the man's shoulder. "Yes, sir?" "Pardon me, but what's your name?" The other showed no surprise. "Grady, sir. Delbert Grady." "But I mean that..." The bartender was looking at him politely. Jack tried again, although his mouth was mushed by gin and unreality. Each word felt as large as an ice cube. Weren't you once the caretaker here? When... But he couldn't finish. He couldn't say it. "Why, no, sir. I don't believe so." "But your wife, your daughters..." "My wife is helping in the kitchen, sir. The girls are asleep, of course. It's much too late for them." "Well, you were the caretaker. Oh, say it. You killed them." Grady's face remained blankly polite. "I don't have any recollection of that at all, sir." His glass was empty. Grady plucked it from Jack's unresisting fingers and set about making another drink for him. There was a small white plastic bucket on his cart that was filled with olives. For some reason, they reminded Jack of tiny, severed heads. Grady appeared. He speared one deftly, dropped it into the glass, and handed it to him. "But you're the caretaker, sir." "You're the caretaker, sir," Grady said mildly. "You've always been the caretaker." "I should know, sir. I've always been here. The same manager hired us both at the same time. Is it all right, sir?" Jack gulped at his drink. His head was swirling. "Mr. Allman." "I know no one by that name, sir." "But the manager," Grady said. "The hotel, sir. Surely you realize who hired you, sir?" "No," he said thickly. "No, I believe you must take it up further with your son, Mr. Torrance, sir. He understands everything, although he hasn't enlightened you. Rather naughty of him, if I may be so bold, sir. In fact, he's crossed you at almost every turn, hasn't he? And him not yet 6. Yes, Jack said. He has. There was another wave of laughter from behind them. He needs to be corrected, if you don't mind me saying so. He needs a good talking to. And perhaps a bit more. My own girls, sir, didn't care for the Overlook at first. One of them actually stole a pack of my matches and tried to burn it down. I corrected them. I corrected them most harshly. And when my wife tried to stop me from doing my duty, I corrected her. He offered Jack a bland, meaningless smile. I find it a sad but true fact that women rarely understand a father's responsibility to his children. Husbands and fathers do have certain responsibilities, don't they, sir? Yes, Jack said. They didn't love the Overlook as I did, Grady said, beginning to make him another drink. Silver bubbles rose in the upended gin bottle. Just as your son and wife don't love it. Not at present, anyway. But they will come to love it. You must show them the error of their ways. Mr. Torrance, do you agree? Yes, I do. He did see. He had been too easy with them. Husbands and fathers did have certain responsibilities. Father knows best. They did not understand. That in itself was no crime. But they were willfully not understanding. He was not ordinarily a harsh man, but he did believe in punishment. And if his son and his wife had willfully set themselves against his wishes, against the things he knew were best for them, then didn't he have a certain duty? A thankless child is sharper than a serpent's tooth, Grady said, handing him his drink. I do believe that the manager could bring your son into line, and your wife would shortly follow. Do you agree, sir? He was suddenly uncertain. But if they could just leave, after all, it's me the manager wants, isn't it? It must be, because why? He shouldn't know, but suddenly he didn't. Oh, his poor brain was swimming.
Bad dog!
Derwent was saying loudly to a counterpoint of laughter.
Bad dog to piddle on the floor!
Of course you know, Grady said, leaning confidently over the cart. Your son is attempting to bring an outside party into it. Your son has a very great talent, one that the manager could use to even further improve the Overlook, to further enrich it, shall we say. But your son is attempting to use that very talent against us. He is willful, Mr. Torrance, sir. Willful. Outside party? Jack asked stupidly. Grady nodded. Who? A black man, Grady said. A black cook. Halloran? I believe that is his name, sir, yes. Another burst of laughter from behind them was followed by Roger saying something in a whining, protesting voice.
Yes, yes, yes!
Derwent began to chant. The others around him took it up. Before Jack could hear what they wanted Roger to do now, the band began to play again. The tune was Tuxedo Junction, with a lot of mellow sax in it, but not much soul. Soul? Soul hasn't even been invented yet. Or has it? He opened his mouth to speak, not knowing what might come out. What did was, I was told you hadn't finished high school. But you don't talk like an uneducated man. It's true that I left organized education very early, sir. But the manager takes care of his help. He finds that it pays. Education always pays, don't you agree, sir? Yes, Jack said dazedly. For instance, you show a great interest in learning more about the Overlook Hotel. Very wise of you, sir. Very noble. A certain scrapbook was left in the basement for you to find. By whom? Jack asked eagerly. By the manager, of course. Certainly other materials could be put at your disposal if you wish them. Well, I do, very much. He tried to control the eagerness in his voice and failed miserably. Well, you're a true scholar, Grady said. Pursue the topic to the end. Exhaust all sources. He dipped his low-browed head, pulled out the lapel of his white mess jacket, and buffed his knuckles at a spot of dirt that was invisible to Jack. And the manager puts no strings on his largesse, Grady went on. Not at all. Look at me, a 10th grade dropout. Think how much further you yourself could go in the Overlook's organizational structure. Perhaps, in time, to the very top. Really? Jack whispered. But that's really up to your son to decide, isn't it? Grady asked, raising his eyebrows. The delicate gesture went oddly with the brows themselves, which were bushy and somehow savage. Up to Danny? Jack frowned at Grady. No, of course not. I wouldn't allow my son to make decisions concerning my career. Not at all. Well, what do you take me for? A dedicated man, Grady said warmly. Perhaps I put it badly, sir. Let us say that your future here is contingent upon how you decide to deal with your son's waywardness. I make my own decisions, Jack whispered. You must deal with him. Well, I will. Firmly. I will. A man who cannot control his own family holds very little interest for our manager. A man who cannot guide the courses of his own wife and son could hardly be expected to guide himself, let alone assume a position of responsibility in an operation of this magnitude. I said I'll handle him, Jack shouted, suddenly enraged. Tuxedo Junction had just concluded, and a new tune hadn't begun. His shout fell perfectly into the gap, and conversation suddenly ceased behind him. His skin suddenly felt hot all over. He became fixedly positive that everyone was staring at him. They had finished with Roger and would now commence with him. Roll over, sit up, play dead. If you play the game with us, we'll play the game with you. Position of responsibility. They wanted him to sacrifice his son. Now he follows Harry everywhere, wagging his tail behind him. Roll over, play dead, chastise your son. Right this way, sir, Grady was saying. Something that might interest you. The conversation had begun again, lifting and dropping in its own rhythm, weaving in and out of the band music, now doing a swing version of Lennon and McCartney's Ticket to Ride. I've heard better over supermarket loudspeakers. He giggled foolishly. He looked down at his left hand and saw there was another drink in it, half full. He emptied it at a gulp. Now he was standing in front of the mantelpiece, the heat from the crackling fire that had been laid in the hearth warming his legs. A fire? In August? Yes. And no. All times are one. There was a clock under a glass dome, flanked by 2 carved ivory elephants. Its hands stood at a minute to midnight. He gazed at it blearily. Had this been what Grady wanted him to see? He turned around to ask, but Grady was gone. Halfway through Ticket to Ride, the band wound up in a brassy flourish.
The hour is at hand!
Horace Derwent proclaimed.
Midnight! Unmask! Unmask!
He tried to turn again, to see what famous faces were hidden beneath the glitter and paint and masks. But he was frozen now, unable to look away from the clock. Its hands had come together and pointed straight up.
Unmask! Unmask!
The chant went up. The clock began to chime delicately along the steel runner below the clock face from the left to the right. Two figures advanced. Jack watched, fascinated, the unmasking forgotten. Clockwork whirred. Cogs turned and meshed. Brass warmly glowing. The balance wheel rocked back and forth precisely. One of the figures was a man standing on tiptoe, with what looked like a tiny club clasped in his hands. The other was a small boy wearing a dunce cap. The clockwork figures glittered, fantastically precise. Across the front of the boy's dunce cap, he could read the engraved word, Fool. The two figures slipped into the opposing ends of a steel axis bar. Somewhere, tinkling on and on, were the strains of a Strauss waltz. An insane commercial jingle began to run through his mind to the tune, Buy dog food, Ralph, Ralph, Ralph. Buy dog food. The steel mallet in their clockwork daddy's hands came down on the boy's head. The clockwork sun crumbled forward. The mallet rose and fell, rose and fell. The boy's upstretched, protesting hands began to falter. The boy sagged from his crouch to a prone position. And still the hammer rose and fell to the light, tinkling air of the Strauss melody. And it seemed that he could see the man's face working and nodding and constricting. Could see the clockwork daddy's mouth opening and closing as he berated the unconscious, bludgeoned figure of the sun. A spot of red flew up against the inside of the glass dome. Another followed. Two more splattered beside it. Now the red liquid was spraying up like an obscene rain shower, striking the glass sides of the dome and running, obscuring what was going on inside. And flecked through the scarlet were tiny gray ribbons of tissue, fragments of bone and brain. And still he could see the hammer rising and falling as the clockwork continued to turn and the cogs continued to mesh the gears and teeth of this cunningly made machine.
Unmask! Unmask!
Derwent was shrieking behind him, and somewhere a dog was howling in human tones. The clockwork can't bleed. Clockwork can't bleed. The entire dome was splashed with blood. He could see clotted bits of hair, but nothing else, thank God. He could see nothing else, and still he thought he would be sick because he could hear the hammer blows still falling, could hear them through the glass just as he could hear the phrases of the Blue Danube. But the sounds were no longer the mechanical tink-tink-tink noises of a mechanical hammer striking a mechanical head. The soft and squashy thudding sounds of a real hammer slicing down and whacking into a spongy, muddy ruin. A ruin that had once been Unmask! The Red Death held sway over all. With a miserable rising scream, he turned away from the clock, his hands outstretched, his feet stumbling against one another like wooden blocks, as he begged them to stop, to take him, Danny Windy, to take the whole world if they wanted it, but only to stop and leave him a little sanity, a little light. The ballroom was empty. The chairs with their spindly legs were upended on tables covered with plastic dust drops. The red rug, with its golden tracings, was back on the dance floor, protecting the polished hardwood surface. The bandstand was deserted except for a disassembled microphone stand and a dusty guitar leaning stringless against the wall. Cold morning light, winter light, fell languidly through the high windows. His head was still reeling. He still felt drunk. But when he turned back to the mantelpiece, his drink was gone. There were only the ivory elephants and the clock. He stumbled back across the cold, shadowy lobby and through the dining room. His foot hooked around a table leg and he fell full length, upsetting the table with a clatter. He struck his nose hard on the floor and it began to bleed. He got up, snuffling back blood and wiping his nose with the back of his hand. He crossed to the Colorado Lounge, shoved through the batwing doors, making them fly back and bang into the walls. The place was empty, but the bar was fully stocked. God be praised. Glass and the silver edging on labels glowed warmly in the dark. Once, he remembered, a very long time ago, he had been angry that there was no back bar mirror. Now he was glad. Looking into it, he would have seen just another drunk fresh off the wagon. Bloody nose, untucked shirt, hair rumpled, cheeks stubbly. This is what it's like to stick your whole hand into the nest. Loneliness surged over him suddenly and completely. He cried out with sudden wretchedness and honestly wished he were dead. His wife and son were upstairs with the door locked against him. The others had all left. The party was over. He lurched forward again, reaching the bar. "Lloyd, where the fuck are you?" he screamed. There was no answer. In this well-padded room, his words did not even echo back to give the illusion of company. "Grady!" No answer. Only the bottles standing stiffly at attention.
Roll over. Play dead. Fetch. Play dead. Sit up. Play dead.
Never mind, I'll do it myself, goddammit. Halfway over the bar, he lost his balance, pitched forward, hitting his head, a muffled blow on the floor. He got up on his hands and knees, his eyeballs moving disjointed from side to side, fuzzy muttering sounds coming from his mouth. Then he collapsed. His face turned to one side, breathing in harsh snores. Outside, the wind whooped louder, driving the thickening snow before it. It was 8:30 a.m. Chapter 45. Stapleton Airport, Denver. At 8:31 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, a woman on TWA's Flight 196 burst into tears and began to bugle her own opinion, which was perhaps not unshared among some of the other passengers, or even the crew for that matter, that the plane was going to crash. The sharp-faced woman next to Halloran looked up from her book and offered a brief character analysis. Nanny. And went back to her book. She had downed 2 screwdrivers during the flight, but they seemed not to have thawed her at all.
It's going to crash!
The woman was crying out shrilly.
I just know it is!
A stewardess hurried to her seat and squatted beside her. Halloran thought to himself that only stewardesses and very young housewives seemed able to squat with any degree of grace. It was a rare and wonderful talent. He thought about this while the stewardess talked softly and soothingly to the woman, quieting her bit by bit. Halloran didn't know about anyone else on 196, but he personally was almost scared enough to shit peach pits. Outside the window, there was nothing to be seen but a buffeting curtain of white. The plane rocked sickeningly from side to side with gusts that seemed to come from everywhere. The engines were cranked up to provide partial compensation, and as a result, the floor was vibrating under their feet. There were several people moaning and tourists behind them. One stew had gone back with a handful of fresh airsick bags. And a man 3 rows in front of Halloran had whoopsed into his National Observer and had grinned apologetically at the stewardess who came to help him clean up.
That's all right,
She comforted him.
That's how I feel about the Reader's Digest.
Halloran had flown enough to be able to surmise what had happened. They had been flying against bad headwinds most of the way. The weather over Denver had worsened suddenly and unexpectedly, and now it was just a little late to divert for some place where the weather was better. Feets don't fail me now. Buddy boy, this is some fucked up cavalry charge. The stewardess seemed to have succeeded in curbing the worst of the woman's hysterics. She was snuffling and honking into a lace handkerchief, but had ceased broadcasting her opinions about the flight's possible conclusion to the cabin at large. The stew gave her a final pat on the shoulder and stood up just as 747 gave its worst lurch yet. The stewardess stumbled backward and landed in the lap of the man who had whoopsed into his paper, exposing a lovely length of nylon thigh. The man blinked and then patted her kindly on the shoulder. He smiled back, but Halloran thought that the strain was showing. It had been one hell of a hard flight this morning. There was a little ping as the no-smoking light reappeared. "This is the captain speaking," a soft, slightly southern voice informed them. "We're ready to begin our descent to Stapleton International Airport. It has been a rough flight, for which I apologize. The landing may be a bit rough also, but we anticipate no real difficulty. Please observe the fasten seat belts and no smoking signs. And we hope you enjoy your stay in the Denver metro area. We also hope..." Another hard bump rocked the plane and then dropped her with a sickening elevator plunge. Halloran's stomach did a queasy hornpipe. Several people, not all women by any means, screamed. "That we'll see you again on another TWA flight real soon." "Not bloody likely," someone behind Halloran said. "So silly," the sharp-faced woman next to Halloran remarked, putting a matchbook cover into her book and shutting it as the plane began to descend. "When one has seen the horrors of a dirty little war, as you have, or sensed the degrading immorality of CIA dollar diplomacy intervention, as I have, a rough landing pales into insignificance. Am I right, Mr. Halloran?"
"As rain, ma'am," he said, and looked bleakly out into the wildly blowing snow.
"How is your steel plate reacting to all of this, if I might inquire?"
"Oh, my head's fine," Halloran said. "It's just my stomach that's a mite queasy."
"A shame." She reopened her book. As they descended through the impenetrable clouds of snow, Halloran thought of a crash that had occurred at Boston's Logan Airport a few years ago. The conditions had been similar, only fog instead of snow had reduced visibility to zero. The plane had caught its undercarriage on a retaining wall near the end of a landing strip. What had been left of the 89 people aboard hadn't looked much different from a hamburger helper casserole. He wouldn't mind so much if it was just himself. He was pretty much alone in the world now, and attendance at his funeral would be mostly held down to the people he had worked with and that old renegade Masterton, who would at least drink to him. But the boy was depending on him. He was maybe all the help the child could expect, and he didn't like the way the boy's last call had been snapped off. He kept thinking of the way those hedge animals had seemed to move. A thin white hand appeared over his. The woman with the sharp face had taken off her glasses. Without them, her features seemed much softer. "It'll be all right," she said. Halloran made a smile and nodded. As advertised, the plane came down hard, reuniting with the earth forcefully enough to knock most of the magazines out of the rack at the front and send plastic trays cascading out of the galley like oversized playing cards. No one screamed, but Halloran heard several sets of teeth clicking violently together like gypsy castanets. Then the turbine engines rose to a howl, breaking the plane, and as they dropped in volume, the pilot's soft southern voice, perhaps not completely steady, came over the intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed at Stapleton Airport. Please remain in your seats until the plane has come to a complete stop at the terminal. Thank you." The woman beside Halloran closed her book and uttered a long sigh. "We live to fight another day, Mr. Halloran." "Ma'am, we aren't done with this one yet." "True, very true. Would you care to have a drink in the lounge with me?" "I would, but I have an appointment to keep." "Pressing." "Very pressing," Halloran said gravely. "Something that'll improve the general situation in some small way, I hope." "Well, I hope so, too," Halloran said and smiled. She smiled back at him, 10 years dropping silently from her face as she did so. Because he had only the flight bag he'd carried for luggage, Halloran beat the crowd to the Hertz desk on the lower level. Outside the smoked glass windows, he could see the snow still falling steadily. The gusting wind drove white clouds of it back and forth, and the people walking across to the parking area were struggling against it. One man lost his hat, and Halloran could commiserate with him as it whirled high, wide, and handsome. The man stared after it, and Halloran thought, just forget it, man. That Hamburg ain't coming down till it gets to Arizona. On the heels of that thought, if it's this bad in Denver, what's it going to be like west of Boulder? Best not to think about that, maybe.
Can I help you, sir?
A girl in Hertz yellow asked him. If you got a car, you can help me, he said with a big grin. For a heavier than average charge, he was able to get a heavier than average car, a silver and black Buick Electra. He was thinking of the winding mountain roads rather than style. He would still have to stop somewhere along the way and get chains put on. He wouldn't get far without them. How bad is it? He asked as she handed him the rental agreement to sign.
Oh, they say it's the worst storm since 1969,
she answered brightly.
Do you have far to drive, sir?
Farther than I'd like.
Well, if you'd like, sir, I can phone ahead to the Texaco station at Route 270 Junction, and they'll put chains on for you.
Well, that would be a great blessing, dear. She picked up the phone and made the call.
Well, they'll be expecting you.
Thank you so much. Leaving the desk, he saw the sharp-faced woman standing on one of the queues that had formed in front of the luggage carousel. She was still reading her book. Halloran winked at her as she went by. She looked up, smiled at him, and gave him a peace sign. Shine. He turned up his overcoat collar, smiling, shifted his flight bag to the other hand. Only a little one, but it made him feel better. He was sorry he'd told her that fish story about having a steel plate in his head. He mentally wished her well, and as he went out into the howling wind and snow, he thought she wished him the same in return. The charge for putting on the chains at the service station was a modest one, but Halloran slipped the man at work in the garage bay an extra 10 to get moved up a little way on the waiting list. It was still 10:15 before he was actually on the road, the windshield wipers clicking and the chains clinking with tuneless monotony on the Buick's big wheels. The turnpike was a mess. Even with the chains, he could go no faster than 30. Cars had gone off the road at crazy angles, and on several of the grades, traffic was barely struggling along. Summer tires spinning helplessly in the drifting powder. It was the first big storm of the winter down here in the lowlands, if you could call a mile above sea level low, and it was a mother. Many of them were unprepared. Common enough, but Halloran still found himself cursing them as he inched around them, peering into his snow-clogged outside mirror to be sure nothing was dashing through the snow, coming up in the left-hand lane to cream his black ass. There was more bad luck waiting for him at the Route 36 entrance ramp. Route 36, the Denver-Boulder Turnpike, also goes west to Estes Park, where it connects with Route 7. That road, also known as the Upland Highway, goes through Sidewinder, passes the Overlook Hotel, and finally winds down the western slope and into Utah. The entrance ramp had been blocked by an overturned semi. Bright burning flares had been scattered around it like birthday candles on some idiot child's cake. He came to a stop and rolled his window down. A cop with fur Cossack hat, jammed down over his ears, gestured with one gloved hand toward the flow of traffic moving north on I-25.
Can't get up here,
He bawled to Halloran over the wind.
Go down 2 exits. Get on 91. And connect with 36 at Broomfield. I think I could get around him on the left,
Halloran shouted back.
That's 20 miles out of my way. What you're rapping? I'll rap your friggin' head,
The cop shouted back.
This ramp is closed.
Halloran backed up, waited for a break in traffic, continued on his way up Route 25. The signs informed him it was only 100 miles to Cheyenne, Wyoming. If he didn't look out for the ramp, he'd wind up there. He inched his speed up to 35, but dared no more. Already snow was threatening to clog his wiper blades. The traffic patterns were decidedly crazy. 20-mile detour. He cursed, and the feeling that time was growing shorter for the boy welled up in him again, nearly suffocating with its urgency. And at the same time, he felt a fatalistic certainty that he would not be coming back from this trip. He turned on the radio, dialed past Christmas ads, and found a weather forecast. 6 inches already, and another foot is expected in the Denver metro area by nightfall. Local and state police urge you not to take your car out of the garage unless it's absolutely necessary, and warn that most mountain passes have already been closed. So stay home and wax up your boards, and keep tuned to. Thanks, Mother, Halloran said, and turned the radio off, savagely.